Prequel, The Walls in the Middle of Idumea, Chapter 2, The Second Day of the Week. The High General of Idumea knocked on the massive double doors of the king's mansion. Today he was expected and going in the correct way. He glanced behind him to see the iron gates closing. Those who lived in the mansion never saw these gates, or the grand but empty road beyond them which led to the heart of the city. Only a quarter-mile down the cobblestones, the tree-lined land ended, and noisy Idumea began on a bisecting road. Over 100,000 people, with their carriages, wagons, horses, and mules, hundreds of shops, inns, houses, and taverns. But at the end of this pristine road leading to the mansion, all was quiet. It was always quiet. No one dared approach, nor seemed to think they should. For so many years, the mansion represented power, an imminent threat. Killing squads notoriously took out anyone who challenged the kings. But since Quirrell III died a few moons ago, most of that power and threat had faded. Unfortunately, thought the High General, no one in the world noticed that fact. Nor had they realized that if ever they wanted to challenge the rule of the kings, now was the time. All that stood in their way were two useless guards in green uniforms flanking the front door. And even the High General would lend anyone a hand in taking them out. Merely flicking the green boys with his fingers ought to suffice. Then again, whoever would be trying to take over the mansion may prove to be an even worse and more idiotic threat than the Quirrells had been for the past 80 years. It was nearly impossible to know who to trust in the city. Factions had sprung up over the years among citizens and the army alike, creating little autonomous societies of who to do business with and who to run away from. A large organized rebellion had never been attempted or considered on the Quirrells, as far as the High General knew. And why should it? Was a killing squad breaking down your door worth the risk? Not if you had enough to eat and plenty of entertainment. And when a killing squad came after your rival, it was great entertainment indeed. Nor did any potential rebels realize that the new High General would likely be on their side, and that the new king who currently inhabited the mansion was made of oatmeal. But there was another reason why no rebellions had arisen, and it had to do with the Garters. Each Quirrell, as he came to power, had demonstrated his ability, by merely sending out the army, to rout out any Garters. There were rebellions, the High General amended his thinking, men in black who raided at night the villages on the outer edges of their world. They usually struck a year or so after a new king was appointed, as if testing to see if the dictatorship was ready to fall. Garters stole livestock, destroyed crops, and killed any villagers who got in the way. Their attacks were random, illogical, and annoying. So what did the Garters want from the world and the kings? As far as the High General could guess, a good steak and maybe the throne. No one had actually captured any Garters alive to interrogate them as to where they came from and what they wanted with the world. The High General was planning in the back of his mind for their future attack, and the possibility of finally questioning one. But while the threat of Garters would seem like the priority of a new High General, it wasn't. There were far closer, more pressing problems that loomed immediately before him, and they began here in the world's largest mansion. He glanced to the sides of the front facade at the 12-foot-high stone wall, cutting across to divide the sprawling compound behind from the bland garden in the front. No one behind the wall would ever see who was coming and going at the iron gates or the grand front door. The wall continued up along the sides and around the iron gates which he had come through. The garden in front was hardly a garden. Rocks and gravel covered every surface, and a couple of haphazardly placed trees provided anemic shade. It was perfect landscaping for a place which didn't want landscapers. The High General sent a last glimpse back to his coach and 8 soldiers behind the bars. He exchanged the same irritated look with another general standing with his arms folded and glaring at the king's guard. His formidable advisor, shorter but muscular and with deep auburn hair, had been told that he wasn't invited to the mansion and needed to wait outside. His lieutenant colonel stood to the side of the carriage, scowling. "That's not right," High General Shin murmured to himself. "My advising general should be with me, 2 of my guards should accompany me, and I shouldn't have to knock on the door like a door-to-door butcher." Exasperation getting to him, he loudly hollered at the door, "Fresh livers! Come get your fresh livers! Or do you want brains, Coral?" He glanced accusatorily at the 2 young men dressed in green uniforms standing at attention at either side, refusing to look at the army's top officer yelling insults at the door. They should be his men, his soldiers, not some private guard of the king. And who trained them anyway? Their stance was all wrong, their swords too flimsy, their muscles not large enough, and they weren't watching him out of the corners of their eyes. What did they think the corners of their eyes were for anyway? The door swung open with a flourish to reveal a man in his 50s, dressed in silk tails and a frilly shirt, with white gloves on his hands. And no weapons on him, the High General noted with displeasure. He was scowling severely as he said, "Yes, sir." The High General sighed loudly. "You know who I am and why I'm here. Just let me in already. No need for us to stand on ceremony unless we're trying to crush it." The doorman's mustache twitched in agitation, but he held the door open wider. The hulking general was already on his way in, the doorman barely stepping out of his way in time. The general paused in the broad foyer. "I know you need to announce me. Be quick in doing so. I'm a busy man, or better yet, let me do it." He filled his lungs as if ready to bellow again, but the doorman strode swiftly, but grandly, through the foyer to a room on the left. The 10-foot-tall ornate wooden door to the throne room was leafed in gold. The general sneered at it. Then he sneered at everything else in the lavish mansion. "Ridiculous," he murmured quietly. "The ceilings are too high unless you have a flock of pigeons in here. Think of how much wood is needed to heat this place in the rainy season." Surreptitiously, he glanced around the fireplaces and their wood boxes, but nothing and no one was moving in the shadows. "King Quirrell IV will now receive High General Per Shin," the doorman called out majestically, and General Shin rolled his eyes. He plowed into the throne room where he found King Quirrell. There were no personal guards with him, and he was not on his throne. The chair itself was an elaborate and rigid creation of gold with plush cushions, and was strangely the least comfortable piece of furniture in all of Idumea. The High General knew that for a fact because once, years ago, he slipped into the empty throne room and tried out the chair. After a few good bounces, he decided he never wanted to be king. The king stood near a broad and highly polished black table, as if reading one of the many documents lying there. "Fourth," Shin began without any pretense, "we need to discuss your security measures here at the mansion. There's a lot of— What's she doing here?" He stopped in mid-stride and glared at the plump elderly woman, who stood rigid and angry at the other side of the table. In her thick hand was a stack of pages, but she let them drop in her shock to join stacks of other documents on the surface. "How dare you?" she growled in what she likely thought was a grand manner, and even bothered to roll her R's. Her white-gray hair was pulled up into a tight bun, but even it trembled in fury. "I am the widow of your last king, and I demand more respect than this, General." General Shin turned his full attention to the new king, a twitchy, squirrel-like man who was now leaning against the table for support. "While it's always a delight and pleasure to greet your lovely mother, I came to speak with you, Fourth, not her. Send her out to do I don't know what, eat someone's baby or something." "How dare you?" she trilled again, as if forgetting she already used that line, and put her hands on her ample waist. "I dare quite easily, ma'am," Shin roared back at her, putting his hands on his own very wide waist, next to where his long knife was secreted under his jacket. "My appointment is with the king. Don't you have a grandson or two to check on? They recently lost your mother, their mother, you know. Shouldn't you be consoling them or something? I heard that's what lovely grandmothers tend to do. And everyone knows what a lovely woman you are. Lovely." Slowly, she stepped away from the table and headed straight for the general. "I told them you were the wrong choice," she snarled in a low voice. "Only 40 years old, and he thinks he's high general material. Pah! Look at you! The insolence of a child, the decorum of a cow, and the belly of a pig." He had the audacious bravery to take a step closer to her. "At least," he said in an even lower voice, "Mother Queen Jezzy, I don't have the temperament of an old-brain jackass. Ah, but a lovely jackass," he added with a sweet smile. She was only a foot away from him now, trembling in fury and unsure of what she dared to do with it. He loomed over her and whispered, "Lovely." "Mother," the king ventured, growing anxious at the standoff between his mother and his general. "Please?" "Yes," Shin said. "I'm sure the moment I've left, he'll come running to tell you everything the big bully general said to him. Shall I keep notes for you? I know Fourth tends to forget important details." Already he was fishing in his dark blue jacket, his metals clanking softly as he pretended to rummage around for spare scraps of parchment. "You may go," he added dismissively. She held up a chubby finger, waving it in anger. "No one tells me where to go." "But I just did," he said, staring past her finger and into her eyes. "Mother," the king's voice was even more pathetic now. 10 minutes, Jezzy snapped. "That's all this blob of a general needs." She spun and headed toward the door, her yellow silk skirts swishing violently behind her, as if they were a massive sunflower being swung carelessly by a nasty little girl, and her boots clacked angrily on the stone floor. "And a farewell to you, Queen Blobby," the High General called after her pleasantly. "So lovely." After the door slammed, sending the drapes on either side flapping, King Quirrell exhaled and turned to the general. "You really shouldn't speak to her like that. No one does." Shin scoffed, his tone a shade gentler. "Yet she's allowed to speak to everyone like that? Derision is the only language she understands." "Why did you send her away?" Quirrell nearly whimpered. "She knows more about being a king than I do. She was my father's advisor for years." "And why you need new ones, Fourth? You have a dozen advisors. At least, you're paying a dozen men an absurd amount of gold to advise you. So where are they?" He held out his arms to the massive throne room, empty except for the two of them. The king sulked and stared at a rug. "Fourth, you have no idea how to run the world, do you? Well, I'm here to tell you how to run at least some of it. You have a serious security problem. Do you realize that?" Quirrell the Fourth sagged. "Well, I've suspected." "Your wife has been missing for 5 weeks. From these very grounds. Doesn't that alarm you? Your guard hasn't changed at all since then, I've noticed. No increase in numbers. No one in here keeping eyes on us." The king dipped his head sadly. "Well, sure, I'm alarmed," he mumbled, as if only hearing half of what Shin said. "I don't know what happened, you see, and—" "Does your mother like your wife, Fourth?" He looked up sadly. "Does she like anyone?" "She likes your oldest son, I've noticed," Shin said. "Has taken him under her special care, training him up to be the king after you, right? The boy's only 12, but when I was here for my installation dinner, the 5th was already talking disciplinary measures with one of my colonels." The 4th smiled diffidently. "He's impressive, all right." "Not impressive. Worrisome. He was mentioning the killing squads. Fourth, we discussed this before you approved my promotion, and now that I'm official, I'm going to hold you to it. No more killing squads." Quirrell staggered. "But my mother—" "Loves them far too much," Shin told him. "Really, Fourth, she is out of control and has been for years. When your father died a few moons ago, I thought that might be the end of her influence, but it's not, is it? She's probably listening in on this very conversation in secret." He paused, hoping to hear an affronted scoff from behind some wall, but he was disappointed. "You approved the garrison's choice of me as High General because you told me you were afraid of threats to your rule. You wanted someone nice to work with. Per realized that his idea of nice was to tell a sad, pathetic man that his life was in danger. Fourth probably took nice to mean bring me some mead and not bring me all the bad news that you can. But this lump of breakfast porridge who thought he was the king was only stirred around by his mother. The sooner Per could disarm her or despoon her, and he realized the metaphor was getting away from him because it was almost time for midday meal and he was getting hungry. Anyway, the sooner he could reduce the influence of the very large Queen Jezzy, the sooner the rest of the world could start breathing easier. One of those threats lives in this very house, Per confided to the king in a whisper. I'm telling you, Fourth, do you want the people of Idumea to support you? For the villages of the world to remain loyal? You need to disband these killing squads, not just in Idumea, but in all the surrounding villages. You've got 1 million citizens frightened that if they say the wrong thing, your mother's going to send 12 men to stab them. But that keeps them in line, Quirrell insisted. Not anymore, Shin hissed at him. There are whispers of rebellion, quiet discussions of overthrowing your family and electing a king like the villagers elect their leaders. Perhaps the whispers and discussions were only in Per's head, but they had to be somewhere else, right? Quirrell's eyes popped wide open. Surely not. How dare they? You and your mother really need to stop using that line, the High General said, because when people feel constrained and oppressed, they dare all kinds of dangerous things to be rid of that pain. Quirrell sat down and stared into the corner. I don't know, maybe you're right, he murmured. My wife suggested the same thing. She has relations up in Rivers, you know. They warned her that there was talk. Shin took an interested step forward. So there were real whispers and discussions. Did you tell your mother about that talk? Quirrell lifted his eyes to meet the general's and winced. Yes, he mumbled, unsure. How long ago was this, Fourth? Maybe 6 weeks ago? And when did your wife vanish from this mansion in the early morning hours? Quirrell's voice was a whisper, and his wince deepened. Just days later? Shin paced slowly in front of him. Did she send a killing squad to Rivers, Fourth? Your mother? I don't know, he admitted. Shin stopped in front of the king, grabbed him by the shoulders, and shouted in his face, Did she send a squad? It probably was good there were no guards in the throne room, as they would have insisted that the general stop manhandling the king, as if they had a chance to pry the general off of him. Quirrell trembled, and his eyes darted over to a painting on the wall, a large, garish depiction of a basket of ugly dogs. Shin glanced at it, too. Why such an amateurish painting should be in the throne room, he couldn't imagine, until he noticed something. One of the eyes was a little too realistic for the sloppy nature of the painting, and he made a mental note to look for a passage behind that wall on another clandestine visit. I really don't know, the Fourth admitted. Shin released him with a little shove. I have a web of insiders as well, Fourth, which meant he knew a few enlisted men at a couple of forts who he actually trusted. And luckily for you, they've reported no bloodied bodies turning up in villages' amphitheaters as warning to the village. So I'm guessing that if she did send a squad in retaliation, your mother's thugs didn't find their talkers. I want names, Fourth, of every last man she employs, as well as the books about their pay. Where's all the gold coming from to pay them? The garrison will provide the bookkeepers to check those balances. I know your mother employs her own bookkeepers. I want them, too, in person. She won't be happy, Quirrell stammered. Do I look like I care about her happiness? Quirrell took a closer look at the High General and immediately knew the answer. Now, Fourth, this leads to the other big problem. Your wife and what happened to her. Your guards, I suspect, aren't up to the Army standards. I like to believe that had this place been employing my soldiers, your wife would still be here. I've replaced those back gate guards where the deliveries come in, and I've posted guards at that small eastern gate I suspect no one uses. But we should replace all of your useless boys in green. And why are there none of them inside the mansion? There should be 2 posted at each doorway that leads to you and your family, Fourth. Quirrell squirmed in his seat. My guards are very loyal, General. I'm not worried about that. Again, Pear had the feeling that Quirrell really wasn't hearing him, or that he responded with what he thought sounded appropriate, if it fit the current conversation or not. I'm not talking about loyalty. I'm talking about ability, about numbers. I need a personnel list of everyone who works in the mansion. That's not possible. Quirrell cut him off and stood up in his first show of strength. He didn't even reach the general's shoulder. Your first task for me as High General was to figure out what happened to your wife, Fourth. Everything must be possible if you want me to solve this. Every name, every connection of every last employee in this mansion. I need to know everyone who goes in and out of these doors, no matter their age, even children of laborers. Someone took your wife, Fourth, and since there are no signs of a fight or a struggle, she went willingly. That means that she knew who took her, and she trusted them. Loyalty misplaced. Quirrell was staring at the same corner again, unsure of how to respond. But his son knew what to say. Hi, General, the 12-year-old announced from a doorway at the back of the throne room. His tone was far more mature than his age. To what do we owe the pleasure of your visit? He strode into the room through the same door his grandmother had left, with all the carriage and confidence of a colonel. He was of average height for a child his age, with wavy brown hair and a way of keeping his blue eyes half closed as if to indicate disdain and displeasure. He was very good at it. General Shin smirched. To what do we owe the pleasure? Only your grandmother could have taught you to deliver that line with such arrogance. Fifth, good to see you. But his tone indicated he saw nothing good about the visit. I'm here as part of my investigation about the disappearance of your mother. Yes, very sad that, Quirrell the Fifth said, his hands clasped behind him as he paced the floor like an old man. Great tragedy to lose her, he intoned, with no tragedy in his voice. Shin tipped his head. Sounds like you assume she's already dead, Fifth. Not so, General, and I do not appreciate you calling me Fifth. My name is Quirrell, and my father is not Fourth. Shin sat down on a golden sofa and sighed as if bored, but privately he was impressed with the boy's diversionary tactic to shift the conversation away from his missing mother. A natural ruler, or tyrant, both fit. Well, if your parents and grandparents can't think of any other name than Quirrell, Fifth, I need to find another way to distinguish each of you. If I simply say Quirrell, the ears of 2 living males and 3 dead males all prick up, thinking they're wanted. This is why people give family members different names. They came up with something different for your younger brother, after all. Quirrell the Fifth sneered. He wasn't as good at that, and needed more practice so as not to look like his upper lip was stinky. My brother's name of Oren is hardly as distinguished as Quirrell. True, not as many letters, Shin sniffed. In fact, I'd like to see him, part of the investigation, you see. He stood up from the sofa, straightened his blue jacket, and indicated the door. That way? No need. I can see myself through. With 2 Quirrells protesting behind him, General Shin marched through the door, surreptitiously glancing to the left. Yes, there could be a possible hidden door in that panel, with a potential space behind it where the ugly dog painting hung. Later, he told himself, later. He found himself in what he assumed to be a classroom, except it was far too grand and plush. Decorated in silks and drapes over non-windows, with massive fireplaces and sadly dim lighting. The room was wall-to-wall shelves of loose pages and maps. In the middle of the room, at a too-big table littered with parchments and quills, sat a little boy. Skinny and pale in the candlelight, he tried to sit up, but quailed at the sight to the High General. Shin smiled kindly at the boy who should have been outside running around in the sunshine. Oren, is it? I've seen you once or twice before. My name's General Shin, and I'm looking to see how safe you are. Where are your guards? Then the boy's grandmother was right there, where she hadn't been a moment before. But Shin was sure he heard a muffled movement coming from the direction where a hidden door may be. He needs no guards, Queen Jezzy announced. We are perfectly safe. Your daughter-in-law wasn't, Shin reminded her. He kept watch on the boy, who stared up at him with terrified eyes. I'm sorry about your mother, Oren. I'm trying to find her. She was your teacher, right? Oren nodded. So now that she's gone, do you have a new tutor, you and your brother? I am their new tutor, Jezzy said proudly, and they need no other. Shin glanced at her askance. I'll ask the Minister of Education about that. Their mother was a qualified teacher. You, madam, however, are a qualified jackass. Oh, wait, I already used that insult. A qualified turnip. She gasped dramatically, even clutching her chest for effect. A turnip! That doesn't even make sense. How dare you? Then she seemed to remember the general was tiring of that phrase. Just because of your new position, you believe you can be rude and insulting? What happened to the supposedly charming Colonel Shin? Turned into a beast when he became a general? He grinned broadly. Oh, I'm just as charming as you are lovely, he said, and turned again to the younger boy. Oren, a child like you must get bored in this mansion. Who are your playmates? My what? The boy whispered. Friends, Shin clarified. Boys your age that you run around with. Surely you know one or two. Oren glanced nervously at his grandmother, who Shin kept in his peripheral vision. Jezzy didn't give any kind of a hint for an answer. Oren began to stammer like his father. I don't really have a play friend. Well, Shin said casually, kneeling next to Oren, maybe not a friend, but at least you know of another boy. Again, Oren's eyes shifted back and forth, now over to his father, as if asking for permission for something. His lips parted and he said, No? That's too bad, Shin said. Little boys need other little boys to play with. Tackle. Attack. Blame for eating the last piece of pie, that kind of thing? That brought a timid smile to Oren's mouth. Shin grinned. Well, we should see if we could find you someone. He patted Oren on the head, then let a finger drag down the boy's nose with a soft boop as it bounced off the end of it. He stood up. Good to meet you again, Oren. I dare say you're my favorite member of the Quirrell family. And you people really should come up with a last name. The rest of the world did so 150 years ago. Not having a last name sounds so low class. Without another word, and ignoring the shouts of, Come back here, from Jezzy, Shin headed back to the throne room with Quirrell the Fourth on his heels. Shin stopped abruptly, allowing Quirrell to crash into the back of him. He spun and said, I want those employee lists and the payment records by tonight. I'll send a carriage for them at dinner time. And next time my advising general gets to accompany me in here, and you better have more guards on duty. I could have killed you and your family a dozen times over. That's when Quirrell looked down to see the general's long knife, with the flat of the blade pressed against his heart. Never trust anyone entirely, Quirrell, Shin murmured into his ear as he slid the blade up to Quirrell's throat. The king went gray. Especially forth your own mother. Smoothly, Shin deposited the long knife into his belt and patted Quirrell's cheek as if he were a toddler. Then he ran his finger down the king's nose as he had his son and ended with a boop. Dinner time, records. Your mother's bookkeepers. Mine for the night and probably a few days after. Don't worry, I'll try to remember to feed them. And later this week, you may expect a dozen new soldiers as guards for your mansion, compliments of the garrison. With a mischievous grin, Shin bowed deeply and let himself out to the throne room. Quirrell collapsed on a nearby sofa just as his mother and oldest son bustled into the room. "He's gone," Quirrell reported. This had been only the third time the new High General had been to his home, and each time he found the visit exhausting. The man confused him. He hadn't yet decided if Shin was horribly rude or just slightly insane. His mother harumphed if she had something the size of a mouse to clear from her throat. Why did they retire the last High General, a perfectly useful man of 78 experienced years? Young Quirrell V scoffed. Useful as a doorstop, I thought you said once, grandmother, so old and deaf, and he did nothing at all for years. He stopped when he realized that he was at the receiving end of his grandmother's bitter glare. That was one thing he hadn't yet learned. His grandmother could turn on him as quickly as she turned on everyone else. Doorstops, she snarled at her grandson, are infinitely more useful than men half the age and with 10 times the determination. The fourth remained slumped on the sofa. I think that edict of father's might have been a mistake, granting nearly equal rights and governing the world to the High General. Well, it made sense back when General Stumpy was in charge. Jezzy was sure to trill the R in charge. Because he left everything up to your father. More rolling R's. Stumpy's no longer around, the fourth sighed. At least not in the army anymore. Apparently he was retired to a horse stable where he can watch the animals walk back and forth. That's not what Shin does. Mother, he wants your books. And your bookkeeper. I don't know how we can refuse him. He wants to know everything to find Margot. Quirrell looked up at his mother. Do you know where she is? Anything at all about her disappearance? He realized then that he likely should have asked that question weeks ago, but he had been busy. His mother's double chins jutted out as she said, You don't trust your own mother? Shin set you up to ask me that. That man has to be stopped. Outside at the carriage, Shin tipped his head to his advising general to not say a word until they were safely away. King Quirrell's green guards, while likely not as strong or skilled as the soldiers, and apparently without the ability to use peripheral vision, might actually know how to listen to gossip. Only after the two officers were safely inside, with their guard round them, and the lieutenant colonel on the seat next to the driver, and the horses trotting down the cobblestone road, did Shin say to his advisor, That woman has to be stopped. His advisor sighed. You didn't say anything you shouldn't to Queen Jezzy, did you? Shin smirked internally. His advisor was the least tactful man in the army. He'd never know what was the right thing to say, although he frequently pretended he did. History proved otherwise. I did call her lovely, Shin said sincerely. Several times. I was very pleasant. His advisor snorted. Oh, I'm sure you were. And you called Quirrell fourth again, didn't you? And his son fifth, which he so very much appreciated. The family doesn't have enough creativity to choose a last name or come up with different first names. I'm just helping them along. Well, Queen Jezzy renames people too. The rumor is she calls you General Blob. Shin nodded thoughtfully. I like it. Rather uncreative, but it's certainly a sign of affection. His advisor snorted. You realize, Shin, that the reason the rest of us voted for you to be High General is because you're the only man not afraid of the old Queen. Privately, Pear doubted that. They voted for him because they assumed he'd be as complacent and dull as old Stumpy. While Pear was much younger than the old general, he was also hardly what one would consider prime army shape. Too friendly, too cheerful, too seemingly easygoing. Seemingly. But he was no jolly general. He was a troubled man who had been waiting for his moment to make a difference, to fix things. But no one had ever given him more than a passing glance, because he didn't train recruits or develop strategy. No, he had been one of the best officers in charge of supplies that any fort had seen. Always full barns, never anything missing, and plenty of food. He was hardly noticeable, except if he forgot to order new saddles to replace the worn ones. That happened once, back when he was a lieutenant, and it never happened again. He rose through the ranks as far as he could tell, through his charisma and charm, and his ability to make sure that no one ever ran out of boots. The Army can't go far without boots. And he did everything with a winning smile and a hearty laugh. Forts could use a sweet face to break up the mass of sour and bitter ones, especially when they need someone to negotiate with citizens for their entire herd of cattle. The Army had learned some years ago that it's better to first ask politely for what they're about to requisition, letting the villagers think that it was somehow all their idea to feed the entire fort. Pear had been able to sweet-talk any farmer out of any goods, and he always made sure it was for a fair price, plus a little extra not on the books, because the Army wasn't exactly generous. But no one ever really expects that sweet face to do anything serious. That's likely why the Army, shockingly and wonderfully, sat him in the most distinguished seat in the garrison, believing he'd warm it in the most undistinguished of ways. Mostly, they expected him to smile and do nothing. A younger, fresher version of the smelly old General Stumpy. But that's not what Pear was planning. So for the past few weeks, his new advising general had been regarding him with a sneer of disbelief because the High General was acting as if he were in charge of things. Pear met General Humphrey's befuddled sneer with his own smile, feeling deliciously authoritative. Not afraid of Queen Jezzy? Of course I am, as any healthy human would be. I just play with her more, like a mouse with a cat. Eugene sniffed. He didn't believe in any kind of playing. Pear, I wish you'd tell me what you suspect. It's not like you to be so secretive. No offense, General Humphrey, Shin said formally, but right now I'm not sure who to trust. When I have more solid evidence, you will be the first to know. Eugene held up his hands in surrender. No offense taken, and I understand your trepidation. You wouldn't be a good commander if you weren't so cynical. Pear squinted at him. Being a good commander wasn't at all what Humphrey had been hoping for. Cynical? That's not what you said in your nomination speech, Pear said slyly. You claimed that I was, what was it? Affable and amiable, a bridge to the people, the army, and the mansion. You might as well have called me a jovial high general. Eugene scoffed, and Pear was sure he heard undertones of, then why aren't you acting like it? And I also said something about your excessive diplomacy, which everyone says I don't have enough of. Pear barked a laugh because Eugene thought diplomacy was something that you eat with salad. Unfortunately, I sounded a lot like you in there. I called her a lovely jackass. Lovely. Eugene clucked his tongue. Losing your touch already, Shin? No, Pear said, suddenly heavy, fists forming on his lap. Things are not right in that mansion. What else is new? Eugene shrugged that off. Pear wasn't in his usual breezy mood. I mean it. There's something else besides Grandmother Jezzy. Something else we haven't noticed before. Eugene leaned forward, growing interested. What, Pear? Maybe I can help. Pear leaned forward as well, took his finger and drew it down the advising general's nose and ending with a boop. Eugene frowned. What the? Well done, Pear said, sitting back. You've passed the first test. Straightest nose I've ever booped. Pear, half the time I don't know if you're being sincere or just being silly. The new High General of the world fixed his stare on his advisor. I'm usually both all of the time. I like to be efficient. Understood, Humphrey said, even though he didn't. Well, hand me your notes and I and my staff will get to work on them. Wait, you didn't take notes again, did you? Pear tapped his head. It's all in here, where it can't be destroyed or stolen by nosy corporals and sold to Quirrell's spies in the garrison. There still are a few. I'm sure I haven't flushed them all. but I couldn't put off this investigation any longer. Eugene sighed. I need more to work with, Pear. The investigation is going nowhere. I already told you. When I have something solid, I'll give it to you. Work on the problem of that useless colonel in pools, or the issue of the garters instead. I think we should be putting more soldiers in forts in the outer ring of the world. The garters have been quiet for a while, which I guess means they're planning something. The borders are where the most danger is. Humphrey sat back, surprised that Shin was taking such an interest in, well, doing his job. You know, Quirrell and Jezzy won't approve of that, more soldiers on the borders. And I can never figure out why, Eugene. Simple. They don't care. The villagers don't provide them much gold in taxes, so what's the point? The world is to preserve the mansion. Haven't you figured that out yet? That's the point of power, to be served. Pear noticed that he made that claim with a twinge of jealousy. Eugene was only one man away from all the army power. Only one big man away, and too late Humphrey was realizing that General Shin wasn't intending to sit quietly in a corner, but was instead stomping around where no one expected he would. At home, Pear Shin stood in front of his wife, who was darning a sock. Dearest, I make enough gold that you can toss that out and get a new one. She frowned. Why would I do that? Because you're one of the wealthiest women in the world now. That doesn't mean I suddenly don't know how to fix socks anymore. I'm not Queen Jezzy after all. He smiled at her, then let it fade. I booped him, Banu. She glanced up from her work. Booped, Pear? He ran a finger down her narrow, carrot-like nose. They have the same odd bumps. Quirrell, Orin, and my little friend Fangy. Eugene Humphrey, however, does not. No surprise there. Banu sat down his brown holey sock. So what does that mean? Means I don't write down anything yet. Jezzy saw the boy come scurrying into her third-best sitting room with his bucket full of wood. She frowned. He was late today. Bucket! She bellowed, and the boy jumped appropriately. I want cake from the kitchens. Fetch it now from Skinny Cook. Yes, ma'am, the boy chirruped. He dumped his load into the wood box, and she nearly yelled at him for not following her command of now, but realized that he'd likely drop her cake if he still had a full bucket. She stared at her record books, angrily drumming her fingers on them. She'd already sent out her bookkeeper for a break so that she could review in private what General Blob wanted to expose in public, and also to see how she might be able to smudge a few numbers, or columns, or just rip out entire pages. Two of her advisors already told her that she should hand the books over, or Shin could make a scene. Well, let him. What could he possibly do? Whose world was it anyway? General Shin's? What presumption! She was Queen Jezzy, and the world was hers to rule as she saw fit. A few minutes later, Bucket Boy burst through the doors again, stopping to bow briefly, then rushed over and set a large slice of cake before her. He stared at it longingly, but he already had his reward. He was afforded the honor of bringing her the cake. You may go, she said, but the boy now shifted his gaze to her. What is it, Bucket? She said, plunging her fork into the 4 layers. Ma'am, you have a lot of space up here, don't you? She shrugged. Barely enough for the wife of a king, for the mother of a king, for the grandmother of a future king. Some days I use nearly every room up here. It's a tragedy, really. Tragedy, Bucket whispered. That means something sad, right? Jezzy sighed impatiently. What do you want, Bucket? He hitched up his bucket, which he'd need to fill another dozen times, to ensure all of her wood boxes were full. It was good exercise for the little fellow, running up and down 3 flights of stairs each day. It would ensure he'd be strong for when he was old enough to join the Cousin Guard. Cousin Guard, what a stupid name! Now they had her calling them that. They were the king's guard, and rightly so. Just because all of them now happened to be some kinds of cousins didn't mean the mansion's help could rename them. They were beginning to forget their place. Bucket squirmed in front of her, and she wondered if he needed to relieve himself. It was only 3 floors down and outside. "Ma'am, I've been thinking." "No one asked you to." "Sorry, it just happens. You have a lot of space here." "Huh, as much as we all have downstairs." She gasped theatrically. "You want me to share some of my space with your kind?" Bucket recoiled. "No, ma'am, not at all. We're happy where we are in the basement. But, ma'am, there are a lot of sad people out there in the war. The greats said that their houses are the sizes of shacks." Jezzy glanced at the cracks of the window, but relaxed. It was nearly impossible to see out of them. The wood bucket boy had no idea because he wasn't allowed near the covered windows in the front rooms. "But they could be happier with the bigger space, so maybe some of the sad people could live up here." She stared at him, perplexed. "What are you saying? Let people live up here? On my floor? Why?" So, he stammered, "so they could be safe like all of us." She exhaled so loudly that her lips flapped. "Why should I care about that? They deserve their miserable lives, Bucket. I do so much for the family, I have nothing left for the world. Don't presume to tell me anyone else deserves my boundless generosity. Who do you know out there who wouldn't try to kill your family while we slept? No one. You know of no one trustworthy, not a single soul. Now, fill up my wood boxes." His little jaw went up and down a few times, as if trying to form a retort, but Jezzy's glare was enough to bring a man 5 times his age to his knees. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered, and went back to his task with much less energy. Thank you. That's the end of the chapter.